Millionaire's life takes a turn when he finds unknown triplets in his own home. Richard Mitchell was exhausted after 2 weeks of endless meetings abroad. All he wanted was a hot shower and his king-size bed. When he turned the knob of his master suite in the Westchester mansion in New York City, something felt off. In the dim light of the navy blue bedroom, 3 small bodies occupied his bed. 3 identical heads with tousled blonde hair rested on his imported pillows. Richard froze, his heart racing. Who were these children? How had they gotten in? His first instinct was to call security, but something stopped him. On the nightstand, a yellowed envelope with his name handwritten on it caught his attention. When he opened it, his hands trembled so much he nearly dropped the perfumed paper. "Richard, I know we never truly forgave each other. These are Michael, Matthew, and Mason, your nephews. They're 7 years old and all I have left in the world. I need you to look after them for a while. They think you're their father. They only know you from old photos I kept. Please don't ruin that illusion. I promise to explain everything when I return." Robert, his twin brother, missing for nearly a decade, had now sent 3 children to his doorstep without further explanation. Richard sank heavily into the leather armchair in the room, trying to process the absurd situation. "Dad?" A sleepy voice broke the silence. Richard looked up. One of the boys was watching him with eyes the same color as his own. The businessman felt a lump in his throat. The children were the mirror image of him and Robert at that age. "You finally came back," the boy said, rubbing his eyes with a shy smile. "We missed you." Before he could respond, Richard heard hurried footsteps in the hallway. Mrs. Wilson, his trusted housekeeper of over 15 years, appeared at the door looking flustered. "Sir, I tried to warn you. They arrived yesterday with a woman who said she was your brother's assistant. She had all the paperwork, and since you weren't answering your phone..." Richard raised a hand, cutting her off. His head throbbed. At 48, he had built a real estate empire from scratch, but he had never prepared for something like this. His meticulously organized routine, his minimalist apartment where everything had its place, and most of all, his deliberately solitary life, all of it would be upended by this unexpected turn. "Mrs. Wilson, prepare the guest room for them," he ordered, regaining his usual composure, "and try to find any contact for Robert." She nodded and left, leaving Richard alone again with the boys, who were now waking up one by one, as if synchronized. "Where are the presents?" asked another of the triplets, so similar to the first it was impossible to tell them apart at a glance. "Presents," Richard repeated, confused. "You always bring presents when you come back from trips," the third boy explained, now fully awake. "At least you did before you disappeared." The words hit Richard like a punch. To these children, he was the father who had vanished and now returned. How could he explain he wasn't who they thought? "This time I didn't have a chance to buy anything," he replied, feeling like an imposter. "But we'll fix that tomorrow." The boys seemed to accept the answer, jumping out of bed with the boundless energy of childhood. Richard noticed their worn-out pajamas and the single small backpack each had. Clearly, his brother wasn't in good financial shape. "You must be hungry," he said, checking his watch. It was past midnight. "We are," they answered in unison, their faces lighting up with identical smiles. As he led them to the pristine kitchen he rarely used, Richard struggled to gather his thoughts. He'd have to cancel the meeting with the Chinese investors the next morning. The expansion project on the Gulf Coast would have to wait. His executive assistant, Paul, wouldn't be happy, much less Victoria Price, the CFO who'd spent years trying to take his place as president of the company. In the kitchen, Richard realized there was no proper food for kids. His fridge held only some fruit, mineral water, and wine. The cabinets stored imported coffee and rare teas, nothing that could satisfy 3 7-year-old boys. "What do you usually eat before bed?" he asked, feeling completely out of his element. "Chocolate milk and buttered bread," one replied promptly. "Or instant noodles," added another. Richard sighed. "We'll have to improvise." As he heated milk on a stove he barely knew how to use, he watched the 3 boys now exploring his meticulously organized kitchen. They looked absolutely identical at first glance, but he began noticing small differences. One had a more curious gaze, another seemed shyer, the third more talkative. "What's your name?" he asked, directing the question to the most talkative one. "Dad, you forgot our names," the boy replied, looking genuinely shocked. Richard felt his face burn. "Of course not, I'm just testing you." "I'm Matthew," the boy said, pointing to himself. Then he gestured to his brothers. "That's Michael, and the other one's Mason." Richard tried memorizing something to tell them apart. Matthew had a small birthmark near his left ear. Michael's hair seemed slightly lighter. Mason was the shortest of the three, if only by a couple of inches. The milk began boiling over, spilling onto the pristine stove. The boys laughed as Richard scrambled to clean the mess with dish towels he'd never used before. "You're still a disaster in the kitchen, Dad," Michael said between giggles. That casual remark made Richard realize his brother must have been just as inept in the kitchen as he was. Small similarities that remained despite years apart. After serving them warm milk and some cookies Mrs. Wilson kept in a jar, Richard led them to the guest room, an elegant but cold space decorated in shades of grey and navy, with no trace of coziness or familiarity for children. "Tomorrow we'll buy some things for you," he said, trying to sound reassuring. The boys glanced around with puzzled expressions. "Why can't we stay in your room like before?" asked Mason, the quietest of the three. "Because you're too big for that now," Richard improvised. "You each need your own space." They didn't seem convinced, but didn't argue. Richard settled the three boys into the guest room's king-sized bed, realizing he had no clue how this was supposed to work. Was there a bedtime ritual? A lullaby? A story? "Do you need anything before sleeping?" he asked hesitantly. "The story," Matthew exclaimed. "You always tell us a story before bed." Richard swallowed hard. "How about we save the story for tomorrow?" "It's really late and—" "Please, Dad," Michael begged, pouting in a way that had surely worked on Robert many times before. "Just a short one." Richard gave in, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Fine, a short story." His mind scrambled for memories from his own childhood. What stories had his mother told before she left? What tales had he and Robert made up for each other on nights when their father came home too late, too drunk to care? "Once upon a time there were two brothers," he began, improvising. The eyes of all three boys fixed on him, full of expectation. They looked so much alike on the outside, but were so different on the inside. Richard continued narrating. A softened version of his and Robert's story, about how they grew up together but took different paths. He left out the painful parts, their mother's abandonment, their violent father, the fights between the brothers, the last argument before Robert disappeared. Instead, he spoke of imaginary adventures, choices, and reconciliations. By the time he finished, the three boys were fast asleep. Richard stayed there for a few minutes watching them. How had Robert managed to raise three sons alone? Why had he never tried to reach out before? And now why had he sent them to him? Back in his office, Richard picked up the phone. The first call was to cancel his morning meeting. The second was to his private investigator. If anyone could find Robert, it was Charles Morgan, a former cop who had solved many delicate problems for Richard over the years. "I need an urgent favor, Charles. It's about my brother." After explaining the situation, Richard hung up with the promise that Charles would start the search immediately. Then he opened his laptop and began researching. How to care for 7-year-olds, basic needs of school-aged boys, how to tell identical triplets apart. By 4 in the morning, Richard finally lay down, not in his bed, but on the office couch. His bedroom still carried the boy's scent, something between cheap shampoo and childhood innocence, a smell that brought back too many memories. His last thought before falling asleep was that, for the first time in years, he was no longer alone in that enormous house, and that terrified him more than any real estate crisis ever could. Richard's awakening was abrupt and disorienting. It wasn't his meticulously set 5:30 alarm or the usual silence of his mansion that woke him, but the sound of children's laughter and something breaking. He jumped from the couch where he'd fallen asleep and rushed to the kitchen, finding chaos. Mrs. Wilson, normally so composed, was trying to clean up a puddle of orange juice while the triplets, already dressed but with messy hair, fought over the last cookies in the package. "Good morning, sir." The housekeeper greeted him with a mix of resignation and amusement. "Breakfast is lively today." "Dad," Matthew exclaimed upon noticing him, "Mrs. Wilson said you're taking us to buy new clothes." Richard checked his watch. 7 in the morning. He'd only slept 3 hours, but strangely he didn't feel his usual exhaustion. A kind of adrenaline kept him alert. "Yes, we're going out to get a few things," he confirmed, accepting the coffee cup Mrs. Wilson handed him. "But first, we need to set some rules." The 3 boys immediately sat down, looking at him with angelic expressions that wouldn't fool anyone. First, no running in the house. Second, ask permission before touching anything. Third, no fighting among yourselves, understood? "Yes, sir," they answered in unison, with a formality that made Richard realize he was speaking, as if in a business meeting, not to 7-year-olds. He softened his tone. "And you can call me Dad." The word felt strange on his lips, almost like a lie, but the smiles he got in return made the discomfort worth it. After breakfast, Richard picked up his phone to cancel more appointments. When he noticed an unread message, it was from Victoria Price. "Heard you cancelled the meeting with the Chinese. Health problem? Or did you finally realize you're not cut out for this deal? The board won't be happy. Emergency meeting scheduled for tomorrow." Richard felt his blood boil. Victoria was clearly using his momentary absence to plot against him. The expansion in the Gulf Coast was crucial for the company, and the Chinese investors represented a potential billion-dollar partnership. Cancelling that meeting had been a serious strategic mistake. "Is something wrong, sir?" asked Mrs. Wilson, noticing his worried expression. "Nothing that can't wait," he replied, putting away his phone. Business would have to wait. First, he needed to resolve the situation with the boys. The morning at the mall was a surreal experience for Richard. Accustomed to buying his clothes from exclusive tailors or on trips abroad, he now found himself dragged by 3 blonde whirlwinds through department stores, children's sections, and noisy food courts. "Can I get this one? And this one too?" Matthew asked every few minutes, holding up colorful t-shirts with superhero or dinosaur prints. "I want one just like his," demanded Michael, not wanting to be left out. "I'd like a different one," murmured Mason, the quietest, who Richard was beginning to realize had tastes distinct from his brothers, despite their identical looks. After 2 hours, they had acquired the basics: clothes, shoes, personal hygiene products, and, at the boys' insistence, a few toys. Richard checked his watch, calculating that he might still have time to swing by the office quickly if they left now. "We're hungry," announced Michael as they passed the food court. The smell of food made Richard realize he hadn't eaten lunch at this hour in years. His disciplined routine included light meals at specific times, usually at upscale restaurants during business meetings. "Burgers," shouted Matthew, pointing to a fast food chain. "Pizza," disagreed Michael. "Whatever," murmured Mason, his eyes fixed on an ice cream shop. Richard sighed, anticipating an argument. "Here's the deal. Today is burgers, tomorrow pizza, and then ice cream." The boys seemed to consider the proposal, exchanging glances as if communicating telepathically. "And can we have dessert today?" negotiated Matthew, clearly the group's spokesman. "If you finish everything," agreed Richard, surprising himself with how easily he gave in. As the boys attacked their meals enthusiastically, Richard checked his phone again. 10 missed calls from Paul, his assistant, and more messages. From Victoria, each more provocative than the last. "Dad, why aren't you eating?" asked Mason, the observant one, noticing Richard was just pushing his food around. "I'm distracted." "By work?" the boy pressed. "You always get that look when you're thinking about work." Richard felt a pang of guilt. Apparently, his brother had been a workaholic too, and it had affected the boys. "No, I'm thinking about yous," he lied. "About how to set up your room when we get home." The 3 faces lit up, and Richard felt an odd warmth in his chest. It was surprisingly satisfying to see them happy. When they finally arrived home, loaded with bags, they found Mrs. Wilson talking to an unfamiliar woman in the living room. The visitor, a middle-aged woman with graying hair pulled into a severe bun and thick-framed glasses, stood immediately. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm Margaret Parker from Child Welfare Services," she introduced herself firmly. "We need to talk." About the situation with these children, Richard's stomach dropped. "Boys, go with Mrs. Wilson to put away the shopping," he instructed, keeping his voice calm despite rising panic. Once the children were gone, the social worker got straight to the point. "We were notified about the sudden arrival of these children in your home. Do you have documentation proving you're their legal guardian?" "They're my nephews," Richard explained, choosing his words carefully. "My twin brother's sons. He's temporarily unable to care for them." "And is there any document formalizing this arrangement?" she insisted, opening a folder full of forms. "Not yet, but I'm working on it," he lied, making a mental note to contact his lawyer immediately. Margaret adjusted her glasses, surveying the surroundings with a critical eye. "This house doesn't seem suitable for children, Mr. Mitchell. I don't see proper recreational areas. We've confirmed there's no designated school for them, and from what I understand, you work full-time." "I'm reorganizing my schedule," Richard defended himself, feeling cornered. "And I've already started making the house more suitable for them." The woman made notes on her form, making Richard even more nervous. "Mr. Mitchell, understand that my concern is solely for the children's well-being. I have a preliminary report here indicating the boys show signs of emotional instability consistent with frequent environmental changes." Richard felt a tightness in his chest. What had Robert done to these children before sending them to him? "I have to be frank," the social worker continued. "Under the current circumstances, I can't recommend the boys stay here without proper supervision. Unless you can quickly establish a suitable family environment and formalize custody, I'll have to begin the process of placing them with a temporary foster family registered in our system." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. Though he barely knew the triplets, the thought of them entering the foster system stirred something protective inside him. "How much time do I have?" he asked, mustering the firmest voice he could. "I'll return in 2 weeks for a full reassessment," she replied, closing her folder. "By then, I expect to see significant changes and proper documentation." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. After the social worker left, Richard locked himself in his office and called his lawyer, explaining the situation in detail. Louis Henderson, who had represented him for over a decade, didn't hide his surprise. "Let me make sure I understand correctly," the lawyer said after hearing everything. "Your twin brother, whom you haven't spoken to in years, left 3 children on your doorstep without warning, and now you want temporary custody of them." "Exactly," Richard confirmed, rubbing his temples as a headache began to form. "And you don't plan to tell the children you're not their father?" Richard hesitated. "Not for now. They've already been through so many changes. I don't want to traumatize them further." On the other end of the line, Louis sighed heavily. "That complicates things, Richard. To obtain custody, you must be completely transparent with the judge, which means disclosing you're not the biological father. Plus, we'll need to locate your brother so he can sign a consent statement." "What if we can't find him?" "In that case, the process becomes much more complex and time-consuming," the lawyer explained. "We'd have to prove abandonment or incapacity, which would require a formal investigation." Richard thanked him for the information and hung up, feeling the weight of the situation. His phone rang almost immediately. It was Paul, his assistant. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm sorry to push, but the situation is critical. Victoria has convinced 2 board members to support a review of your position as chairman. Tomorrow's meeting could be decisive. We need you there." Richard closed his eyes, trying to sort his priorities. "I'll be there, Paul. Prepare all. The materials for the Gulf Coast project. We'll counterattack." When he hung up, he noticed Matthew standing at the office door, watching him curiously. "The others are fighting over the TV," the boy explained. "Can I stay here with you?" Richard hesitated. His office was his sanctuary, untouched by anyone except himself and the housekeeper who cleaned it. But something in the boy's expression kept him from refusing. "Of course, come in, but don't touch anything, okay?" Matthew nodded solemnly and entered, gazing in fascination at the shelves filled with books, architectural models of developments, and the abstract painting on the wall that Richard had acquired at an auction for a fortune. "You work a lot, huh?" the boy commented, sitting in the chair across from the desk. Yes, quite a bit, Richard agreed, surprised by the observation. So you used to work even more, Matthew continued, swinging his legs that didn't reach the floor. We hardly ever saw you. Richard didn't know how to respond. Every casual remark from the children revealed more about how Robert had been as a father. And did that bother you? He asked, genuinely curious. Matthew shrugged. Sometimes. But Aunt Lucy said you worked so hard so we could have a better life. Aunt Lucy? Richard asked, alert to any new information. The lady who took care of us when you traveled, the boy explained matter-of-factly. She left last month. Said she couldn't stay anymore because you hadn't paid her. Richard made a mental note to pass this information to Charles, the investigator. Maybe this Lucy knew something about Robert's whereabouts. Matthew, do you know where where your father usually traveled to? The boy thought for a moment. Places with beaches. You always said you had work there, but you never took us on beaches. Robert was somewhere coastal. It wasn't much, but better than nothing. A scream followed by crying came from the living room, interrupting the conversation. Richard stood immediately with Matthew at his heels. In the living room, Mason was crying while Michael held the remote triumphantly. What happened here? Richard asked, trying to sound authoritative. He hit me, Mason accused between sobs. He started it, Michael defended himself. He wanted to change the channel in the middle of my cartoon. Mrs. Wilson appeared from the kitchen, drawn by the commotion. I told them to take turns after each show, but they didn't listen, she explained, looking tired. Richard had never had to mediate a children's dispute before. In his world of business, conflicts were resolved with clear contracts and occasionally veiled threats. None of that would work with 7-year-olds. Here's what we'll do, he proposed, taking the remote from Michael's hands. For today, the TV is confiscated. But Dad, the two protested in unison. No buts. Instead, we'll... He paused, trying to remember what kids normally did. We'll play a board game. The triplets exchanged confused glances. You never play with us, Michael remarked, wiping his tears. That stung more than Richard expected. His brother, it seemed, wasn't just absent because of work, but also neglectful when he was home. Well, now I'm going to play, he declared with more confidence than he felt. Mrs. Wilson, do we have any games here? The housekeeper smiled, seeming to approve of the initiative. Actually, I have a deck of cards and dominoes stored in the pantry. I used to play with my nephews when they visited. The rest of the afternoon passed surprisingly pleasantly. Richard, who hadn't played any kind of game since adolescence, found himself laughing at the boys' clumsy domino moves and impressed by Mason's memory in the improvised card-matching game. When Mrs. Wilson announced dinner was ready, Richard could hardly believe he'd spent the entire afternoon without checking emails or making work calls. Even more surprising was that he didn't feel his usual anxiety about being disconnected. Dinner was another revelation. Mrs. Wilson had prepared spaghetti with meatballs, a simple dish that Richard Mitchell would normally ignore in favor of his low-carb balanced meals. Yet, seeing the boys' excitement, he allowed himself an exception and discovered that home-cooked food had a comforting flavor his business dinners lacked. Dad, can we go to school tomorrow? Mason asked between bites. The question caught Richard off guard. School? Of course, 7-year-olds needed to attend school. How had he not thought of that? We're still on break, he replied, buying time. When classes resume, we'll see which school is best for you. But break's already over, Michael corrected. Our friends went back to school last week. Richard made a mental note to research nearby private schools that accepted mid-year enrollments, another item on his growing to-do list. After dinner and a bath that turned the bathroom into a small swimming pool, Richard supervised the boys' toothbrushing, learning in the process that each preferred a different brush color: blue for Michael, green for Matthew, and red for Mason. Small details that helped him tell them apart. Bedtime brought the expected request for a story. This time, Richard was prepared. He downloaded a children's storytelling app that afternoon, but to his surprise, the boys refused. We want the next part of yesterday's story, Matthew said, already settled between his brothers. The one about the two brothers, Richard confirmed, feeling cornered. He'd improvised so much he barely remembered where he'd left off. Yes, you stopped when they built the treehouse, Michael reminded him. Richard didn't recall mentioning any treehouse, but nodded as if he did. Ah, right. So after they built the treehouse, he spun a fictional tale about two adventurous brothers, subtly weaving in lessons about honesty and forgiveness, hoping they might one day apply to his real relationship with Robert. When he finished, all three boys gazed at him in awe. More tomorrow? Mason asked with a yawn. I promise, Richard replied, surprising himself with his sincerity. After making sure the boys were sound asleep, Richard returned to his office and called Charles, the investigator. Any news? He asked bluntly. Some preliminary leads, Charles answered. Your brother was in Miami Beach until about 3 months ago. Worked as a beach kiosk manager, paid under the table. After that, he headed to the Gulf Coast, possibly Fort Lauderdale or Key West, still checking. What about that Lucy woman? Lisa Miller, 53, worked as an informal nanny. I got her number but haven't heard back yet. Keep looking, Charles. It's urgent. After hanging up, Richard prepared for the next day's meeting. He needed to be flawless to face Victoria and the board. He reviewed spreadsheets, updated projections, and prepared arguments. By the time he finished, it was past 2 a.m. Exhausted, he headed to his room but paused outside the boys' door, unable to resist peeking in. They were fast asleep, Matthew with an arm draped over his face, Michael hugging his pillow, Mason curled up in a fetal position. There was something inexplicably touching about the scene. Richard closed the door gently, struck by how much his life had changed in just 48 hours. 2 days ago, he'd been a lonely man obsessed with work and order. Now, he was the makeshift guardian of 3 children who believed he was their father. The next morning, Richard woke before his alarm, jolted by a sudden thought. Who would watch the boys during his meeting? Mrs. Wilson could certainly supervise them, but was it enough? What if the social worker made a surprise visit? He quickly dressed in one of his most expensive suits, armor for the corporate battle ahead. In the hallway, he found Mrs. Wilson already awake, preparing breakfast. The boys are still asleep, she informed him. They look like angels. When they're quiet, don't they? Richard agreed with a hesitant smile. Mrs. Wilson, I have a crucial meeting today. Can I count on you to watch them during the day? The housekeeper nodded. Of course, sir. But if I may suggest, perhaps we should consider hiring someone specialized. A full-time nanny, maybe. You're right. Could you look into reliable agencies? As he hurriedly ate his breakfast, Richard realized how much he had underestimated the challenges of caring for 3 children. He'd need to completely restructure his routine and his home if he wanted any chance of gaining custody. The phone rang. It was Paul, anxious about the meeting. Sir, we have a situation. Victoria arrived 2 hours early and is in a private meeting with 3 board members. Richard cursed under his breath, dirty play, typical of her. I'm on my way now. As he was heading out the door, he heard a sleepy voice. Dad, are you going to work? It was Mason, the observant one, standing on the stairs in his new rocket-patterned pajamas. Yes, I have an important meeting, Richard replied, checking his watch. But I'll be back for lunch, I promise. It was a risky promise. Board meetings often dragged on for hours, especially when power struggles were involved. Mason's disappointed expression made him add, and when I get back, we can do something fun together. How does that sound? The boy's face lit up. Can we go to the park? It's been a while. The park, of course, Richard agreed, making a mental note to look up nearby parks. Now go back to bed, it's still early. Mason nodded and climbed the stairs, but not before adding, Do you really promise you'll be back for lunch? Last time you promised and didn't come back for 3 days. Guilt hit Richard like a slap. What had his brother done to these children? How many broken promises had these little ones already endured? I promise, Mason. This time is different. On the way to the office, Richard couldn't focus on the numbers and arguments he'd prepared. His mind kept returning to the triplets, the promise he'd made to Mason, the distrustful look in the boy's eyes. The headquarters of Mitchell Properties occupied the top 3 floors of a skyscraper in New York City's financial district. When Richard entered the lobby, he immediately felt the tense atmosphere. Employees greeted him with worried expressions, some whispering among themselves when they thought he wasn't looking. Paul waited for him at the entrance to the meeting room, visibly nervous. They're all already inside. Victoria brought the quarterly report and is questioning the investment in the Gulf Coast. Richard adjusted his tie. It was time to do what he did best: lead. The meeting was as tense as he'd expected. Victoria, impeccable in her grey pantsuit, had clearly prepared to attack, presenting slides with pessimistic projections about the Gulf Coast project. "As you can see, gentlemen," she said with feigned concern, "Richard's estimates are at best overly optimistic, at worst, completely disconnected from current economic realities." Richard studied the faces around the table. Of the 7 board members, at least 3 already seemed convinced by Victoria. The others awaited his defense. When it was his turn to speak, Richard stood calmly. He began methodically dismantling each of Victoria's arguments, presenting data she had conveniently ignored. Later, he revealed he already had verbal commitments from the Chinese investors, something he had kept as a surprise. The meeting dragged on for hours, with subtle attacks and counterattacks disguised as corporate concerns. When they finally reached a consensus, the project would proceed, but with additional oversight from the board, it was already past noon. Richard checked his watch and felt his stomach drop. His promise to Mason. He was late. "If you'll excuse me, gentlemen, I have another pressing commitment," he announced, gathering his papers. Victoria smiled dismissively. "So soon, Richard? We still have important points to discuss." "They can be addressed at our next meeting," he replied firmly, ignoring the surprised glances. Richard Mitchell never, ever left a meeting early. As he drove home, he called Mrs. Wilson. "How are the boys?" "Just fine, sir. We had lunch and now they're watching TV. Mason asked about you a few times." Richard pressed the accelerator a little harder, surprised by his own eagerness to get home. It wasn't just about the broken promise. There was something more, a genuine desire to see the boys, to hear their silly chatter, to join in their games. When he finally arrived, he found them in the living room, engrossed in a building set Mrs. Wilson had dug out from some forgotten closet. "Dad," Matthew exclaimed when he saw him, "you really came back." The surprise in the boy's voice made Richard realize just how much his brother had let these children down. Every kept promise would feel like a small miracle to them. "Of course I came back," he replied, kneeling to see what they were building. "I promised, didn't I?" "Can we go to the park now?" Mason asked hopefully. Richard glanced out the window. The sky was clear, the day pleasant. "Yes, let's go. Just let me change first." As he went upstairs to swap his suit for something more casual, Richard smiled to himself. In 20 years of his career, he had never left a meeting early. He had never traded a work commitment for playtime. And strangely, he felt no remorse at all. The nearest city park was just a few blocks from the mansion. Still, Richard insisted on driving, worried about safety. The boys protested, wanting to walk so they could see things along the way, as Michael explained. At the park, Richard rediscovered a world he had forgotten. A world of swings and slides, of children running and shouting, of mothers and fathers sitting on benches watching their kids with expressions mixing pride, exhaustion, and unconditional love. "Push us on the swing," Matthew called, already running toward the equipment. Richard obliged, alternating between the 3 swings. He quickly noticed each boy had his own style. Michael loved going as high as possible, laughing wildly. Matthew preferred a steadier rhythm, as if in a trance. Mason swung timidly, but with a serene smile, he rarely showed otherwise. "Higher. Toyajed," Michael shouted. "I want to touch the sky." As he pushed them, Richard caught glances from other mothers and a few fathers in the park. Some smiled approvingly, others seemed to critique his swinging technique. An elderly woman approached with a kind smile. "What lovely boys. Triplets, aren't they?" she remarked, watching the 3. "Yes," Richard confirmed, feeling an irrational pride. 7 years old. "They look just like their father," the woman continued. "Same eyes, same chin. It must be hard raising them alone, I imagine." Richard's throat tightened. He wasn't the father, just an uncle who barely knew his nephews. An imposter playing family. "It has its challenges," he replied vaguely, giving Mason another push. "Always does," the woman agreed. "My husband passed when our twins were 5. I thought I wouldn't make it, but children give us strength we never knew we had. Before Richard could respond, Michael abandoned his swing, running toward the carousel. The other two quickly followed, leaving Richard and the woman watching. At first, we all make mistakes, she continued, as if sharing a precious secret. But in the end, love is what matters. And by the way they look at you, sir, you're doing a good job. With a final smile, the elderly woman walked away, leaving Richard with a whirlwind of thoughts. Was he really doing a good job? Or was he just perpetuating a lie that would end up hurting the boys even more? After 2 hours at the park, Richard announced it was time to go home. The protests were loud, but they stopped when he promised they'd return the next day. "Cross your heart?" Michael asked, holding out his pinky. Richard hesitated, then linked his little finger with his nephew's. "Cross my heart." Back at the mansion, while the boys took a bath, an operation that required Mrs. Wilson's constant supervision to avoid flooding, Richard got a call from Louis, his lawyer. "I have news, Richard. I secured a preliminary hearing to discuss temporary custody. It's next week. The bad news is we need your brother's consent statement by then, or things could get very complicated." "We're looking for him," Richard assured. "Is there any chance we can keep the paternity issue under wraps, at least for now?" Louis hesitated. "Legally, you'll need to clarify your exact relationship with the children, but we can request a sealed record to protect them. That way, they wouldn't have access to the information until you're ready to reveal it." "Make it happen, then." After dinner, while telling another chapter of the adventurous brothers' story, Richard was interrupted by his phone. It was Charles. "I need to take this," he explained to the boys. "I'll be right back." In the hallway, away from curious ears, Charles got straight to the point. "I found that Lucy, she worked for your brother for almost 2 years, taking care of the boys while he worked. According to her, Robert kept changing jobs and cities, always in debt. About a month ago, he got a medical diagnosis that shook him deeply. That's when he decided to bring the boys to you." "What kind of diagnosis?" Richard asked, his chest tightening. "She doesn't know exactly, but mentioned it was something serious. Robert talked about getting his affairs in order and securing the boys' future." Richard leaned against the wall, processing the information. Robert was sick, possibly terminally. Was that why he'd brought his sons to him? A last, desperate attempt to give them a future. "There's one more thing," Charles continued. "According to Lucy, the boys were conceived through IVF. Robert's wife Amber died during childbirth due to complications. He raised all 3 alone after that." The revelation hit Richard hard. His brother, who had always seemed so irresponsible and impulsive, had faced the loss of his wife and raised 3 children alone. Meanwhile, Richard had isolated himself in his corporate empire, convinced material success was all that mattered. "Keep looking, Charles. We need to find him urgently." When he returned to the room, the boys were waiting eagerly. "Who was on the phone, Dad?" Matthew asked, always curious. "A friend from work," Richard lied, settling back on the edge of the bed. Now, where were we in the story? Night after night, the story of the 2 brothers evolved. It was no longer just a distraction, but a way for Richard to process his own feelings about Robert. The boys listened in fascination, unaware they were witnessing Richard's gradual emotional reconciliation with his absent brother. The following days established a temporary routine. Richard rearranged his schedule, delegating non-essential meetings to Paul and working remotely when possible. He hired a nanny recommended by Mrs. Wilson, a young education student named Chloe, who quickly won the boys over with her energy and creativity. He also began transforming the mansion, hiring an interior designer specializing in children's spaces to redecorate one of the guest rooms into a suitable area for the triplets. He bought bunk beds, study desks, bookshelves, and toys. At work, the changes in his routine didn't go unnoticed. Victoria especially seemed irritated by his new, more delegating approach. "Frankly, Richard, your dedication seems to have slipped considerably," she remarked sharply after he declined a business dinner that would run late into the evening. "The board is starting to question your commitment." "My commitment to the company remains unwavering, Victoria," he replied calmly. "I'm just prioritizing my responsibilities more efficiently." The truth was, Richard was beginning to see work in a different light. The long hours at the office, the constant business trips, the 24/7 availability he had always considered essential now seemed optional. Choices he had made, not absolute necessities. At the end of the week, he received an unexpected visit from Paul at his home on Sunday afternoon. The boys were playing in the garden under Chloe's supervision, while Richard reviewed contracts on the porch. "Sorry to drop by unannounced," Paul said, visibly uncomfortable, "but I thought I should warn you in person." "Did something happen?" Richard asked, offering his assistant a seat. Paul sat, nervously adjusting his tie. "It's Victoria. She's conspiring against you more aggressively. She's secured support from 4 board members for a confidence vote at the next meeting. And she knows about the boys." Richard frowned. "What do you mean she knows?" "She hired someone to follow you. She has photos of you with the kids at the park, going into toy stores, leaving work early. She's spreading that you're mentally unstable, that you impulsively adopted 3 children and are now neglecting the company because of it." Anger rose inside Richard, but it was quickly replaced by a calculated calm. Victoria was playing dirty, using his personal life against him. "Thank you for warning me, Paul." "Sir, if I may be frank," Paul hesitated, "who are these children really?" Richard watched the triplets in the garden. Michael was hanging from a tree branch, Matthew was building something with twigs, and Mason was observing an ant with absolute concentration. In just a week, they had completely transformed his life. "They're my nephews, my twin brother's sons. I'm taking care of them temporarily until we locate Robert." Paul looked surprised. "I didn't know you had a brother." "Few people do," Richard admitted. "We grew apart a long time ago." After Paul left, Richard joined the boys in the garden. Chloe smiled when she saw him, an energetic young woman who clearly loved her job. "They're putting together a play," she explained, "about explorers in the jungle." Richard watched as the 3 acted out an improbable story involving talking tigers and hidden treasure. Michael, as always, was the most outgoing, playing both the explorer and the tiger. Matthew crafted imaginary scenes, describing caves and rivers only he could see. Mason, true to his observant nature, narrated the story with comical seriousness. "Dad, you can be the lost explorer," invited Michael, pulling him by the hand. Richard hesitated. He had never been good at make-believe, even as a child, but the hopeful look in the 3 boys' eyes convinced him. "All right." "What should I do?" For a full hour, Richard Mitchell, president of the 3rd largest property developer in the country, played the role of a lost explorer who needed the help of 3 brave boys to find his way back. He surprised himself by laughing genuinely, running through the garden, even roaring like a tiger when the story demanded it. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now back to the story. When they finally announced the end of their little play, Chloe applauded enthusiastically. "You should do more family theater," she suggested. "The boys have a natural talent." Richard nodded, realizing he hadn't had this much fun in ages. He was about to suggest a snack when his phone rang. It was Louis, his lawyer. "Richard, we have a problem. The hearing's been moved up to the day after tomorrow. The judge's schedule is packed, and it was the only available date for weeks." "And Robert's consent?" "That's exactly the problem. Without it, our chances drop significantly." Richard ended the call with a tightness in his chest. Time was running out, and Robert was still missing. That night, after putting the boys to bed, Richard couldn't relax. The mansion's walls, once a refuge of silence and order, now felt suffocating under the weight of responsibility. So much depended on him making the right choice. Lost in thought, his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "We need to talk about my kids. The Rusty Anchor tomorrow 7 p.m. Come alone. Robert." Richard's heart raced. After a week of searching, his brother had finally surfaced. Why now, and why a bar, not his home? The next day, Richard was restless, torn between anxiety about meeting Robert and worry over the looming corporate battle. He could barely focus at work. Even the triplets noticed his distraction. "You okay, Dad?" Mason asked at dinner, watching him with eyes too sharp for a 7-year-old. Just tired, Richard replied, forcing a smile. I have a meeting tonight, but I won't be late. Promise, the boy pressed, and promise. At 6:45 p.m., Richard parked near the Rusty Anchor, a modest spot in Queens, far from his usual circles, the kind of place where no one would recognize the famous businessman Richard Mitchell. The bar was moderately busy for a Monday, filled with workers stopping for a beer on their way home. Richard, in his expensive suit, clearly didn't belong, but no one seemed to notice. He chose a corner table, ordered mineral water, and watched the door. Right at 7 p.m., a man walked in, wearing a cap and sunglasses despite the dim lighting. Richard recognized him instantly, even after all these years. The same build, the same posture, genetically identical, though life's choices had left distinct marks. Robert approached cautiously and sat across from his brother. When he removed the glasses, Richard barely stifled a gasp. His twin looked a decade older, with deep shadows under his eyes and an unsettling pallor. You look well, Richard, Robert said with a faint smile. Life's treated you better than me, it seems. Richard ignored the remark and cut to the chase. Why did you send the boys to me without warning? Why disappear? They think I'm you, for God's sake. Robert let out a deep sigh, a sound heavy with exhaustion. I had no choice. I'm sick, Richard. Advanced stage leukemia. The doctors gave me a few months at most. The words hit Richard like a physical blow. His brother, his identical twin, was dying. Why didn't you come to me sooner? We could have gotten the best treatments, international specialists. Robert shook his head. It's past that point. Besides, I needed to sort out my situation first. What situation? Debts, Richard. So many debts, Robert confessed, running, a hand over his tired face. Amber's IVF treatments cost a fortune. Then when she was passed during childbirth, there were funeral expenses, the costs for the babies. I wasn't in any emotional state to work properly. Richard listened, picturing his brother alone with 3 newborns, shattered by the loss of his wife. Over time, I started to recover, took odd jobs here and there, but it was never enough. The debts just kept growing. We moved constantly, running from creditors. I was always one step ahead of disaster. Why didn't you come to me? Richard repeated, frustration clear in his voice. Robert let out a bitter laugh. After everything we said to each other in that last fight, you made it very clear you never wanted to see me again. Richard remembered the argument 10 years earlier. Unforgivable insults, accusations of betrayal when Robert had gotten involved. With one of Richard's ex-girlfriends, vows to never speak again, which both of them, stubborn as they were, had kept. That was a long time ago, Richard argued. We're talking about your children. Our nephews, Robert corrected. Amber was an only child. Her parents are gone. You're the only family they have besides me. Robert, why do the boys think I'm you? His brother lowered his eyes, visibly ashamed. In the last few years, keeping promises got harder. I worked 2, sometimes 3 jobs. I rarely saw the boys awake. When they got older, I started talking about you. About me? Yes. I told stories about my successful twin brother who traveled the world, showed them your photos in business magazines. Over time, I think I confused them. They started believing the absences, the trips, were all about you, not me working impossible hours at bars and diners. Richard tried to process the information. So they think it's me who barely spent time with them? That I'm the one who broke promises? Robert nodded sadly. It wasn't intentional. I think it was easier for me, too, to pretend life could have been different, that I could have been like you. When I found out about the illness, I had to make a quick decision. The boys would feel safer thinking they'd stay with their father, even if it was just a more present version of him. This is insane, Robert. I can't keep up this lie. Please, Richard, Robert begged, gripping his brother's hands for the first time in a decade. Just until I get things in order. I'm selling what little I have, trying to pay off some debts so I don't leave this burden on you. Then, I promise, I'll come back and we'll explain everything together. Richard studied his twin, seeing not just the physical mirror, but the different choices, the paths each had taken. I need your signature on some documents, he said finally. To get legal temporary custody of the boys, Child Welfare Services is already involved. Robert looked alarmed. Child welfare? Why? Someone reported the irregular situation. Probably a nosy neighbor. Damn, Robert muttered. This complicates everything. There's a hearing the day after tomorrow. Without your formal permission, I could lose the boys to the system. Robert's expression turned to pure panic. I can't let that happen. Tell me where to sign. Richard called Louis, who promptly sent the documents to his phone. Robert, sign digitally, making the temporary custody transfer official. Thank you, Richard, Robert said, his voice choked. I know I have no right to ask anything after all this time, but take good care of them. They're amazing, Robert, Richard replied sincerely. You did a good job despite everything. A tear rolled down Robert's weary face. I tried. God knows I tried. Mason is the most sensitive, you know. He notices everything. Matthew is the curious one, always asking questions, and Michael is the leader, Richard finished, the adventurer. Robert smiled, genuinely surprised. You already know them well. I'm learning, Richard admitted. When are you coming back to talk to them? Robert hesitated. I need to sort out a few things first. A week or two at most. Can you keep being me for now? Richard wanted to protest, to explain how this lie could further damage the boys' already fragile trust. But something in his brother's desperate gaze stopped him. All right, but no more than 2 weeks, Robert. They deserve the truth. The brothers parted with an awkward hug, the first in over 10 years. Richard watched Robert walk away, noticing his slightly unsteady gait. His brother was truly sick, that much was undeniable. On the way home, Richard felt a jumble of emotions. Relief at finally finding Robert and securing his signature for the hearing. Anger at the lie his brother had created and that he was now perpetuating. Sadness for the illness consuming Robert. And surprisingly, gratitude for having the triplets in his life, even if only temporarily. When he got home, it was past 10. Chloe had stayed beyond her usual hours to wait for him. The boys only fell asleep after I promised you'd see them when you got back, she explained, even if they were already asleep. Richard thanked her and quietly went up to the boys' room. In the dark, he watched the 3 small, sleeping forms. They'd gotten what they wanted. All 3 were sharing the same bed, despite there being 3 separate beds in the room. Mason, ever the watchful one, opened his eyes sleepily. Dad, you're back. I promised I would be, didn't I? Richard replied softly, adjusting the blanket over him. The boy murmured, already drifting back to sleep. You're different now. Different how? Richard asked, curious. More here, Mason answered cryptically, before falling asleep. Again, Richard stayed there for a few minutes, pondering Mason's words. More here. Present, perhaps. Involved, available. All the things neither he nor Robert had apparently been for these boys. The next morning, over breakfast with the triplets, Richard made an announcement. I'm working from home today. How about we spend the afternoon by the pool? The suggestion was met with unrestrained excitement. Richard realized that despite living in a mansion with a pool for a week, the boys hadn't had a chance to swim yet. The morning passed quietly, with Richard attending video conferences from his office while the boys had tutoring with Chloe. Through careful conversations, Richard had learned that the boys had attended public schools in different cities, always, moving before finishing a school year. Their education had significant gaps that needed filling before they could enroll in a private school. After lunch, as promised, he took them to the pool. He discovered that despite being 7 years old, none of the 3 knew how to swim properly. You've never had swimming lessons? He asked, helping Michael float with a board. Once, Matthew answered, clinging to the pool's edge. But you said it was too expensive, so we stopped. Richard made a mental note to hire a swimming instructor. It was a basic skill every child should have, especially living in a house with a pool. While teaching the boys the basic swimming movements, Richard received a call from Paul. Reluctantly, he stepped out of the pool to answer. Sir, sorry to interrupt, but Victoria called an emergency vote for tomorrow. She claims you're emotionally compromised and unfit to lead the company. Richard felt his anger rise. Victoria was playing dirtier than he'd imagined. I'll be there, Paul. Prepare everything. Financial reports from the last 3 quarters, updated projections, status of all ongoing projects. We'll show who's truly committed to this company. When he returned to the pool, the boys watched him with worried expressions. Work again, huh? Asked Michael, sounding older than his 7 years. Yes, but nothing that can't wait, Richard replied, stepping back into the water. Now, where were we? Ah, yes, the backstroke. The afternoon by the pool was only interrupted by the snack prepared by Mrs. Wilson. Sandwiches, fresh juices and fruit served outside. Richard watched the boys eating hungrily, already tanner after a few hours in the sun. Dad, Matthew suddenly said, his mouth full of sandwich. Why is our house so different now from the old one? Richard swallowed hard. What do you mean? Our old house was small, Matthew explained. And you were never there. Here it's huge and you're always with us. What changed? It was the question Richard feared, the one that exposed the inconsistencies in the story. How could he explain why their dad suddenly lived in a mansion, owned a company and spent more time with them? I made some important decisions, he answered slowly. I realized I was losing what really matters. You 3. The boys looked at him with solemn expressions, absorbing his words. So you won't leave anymore? Asked Mason, the most direct of the 3 when it came to emotions. I'm not going anywhere, Richard promised, feeling the weight of his words as he said them. That night, as he tucked them into bed, Richard tried to gather more information about Robert, disguised as reminiscing. Do you remember the last house we lived in before coming here? He asked casually. In Miami Beach, Michael answered promptly. Near the beach, but we almost never went because you worked all day. And before that? Chicago, said Matthew. It was really cold there. The house had mold on the walls, Richard kept asking, mapping the erratic path Robert had taken with the boys. Denver, San Francisco, New Orleans, always places big enough to disappear. To start over. And where were you born? Do you remember? All 3 shook their heads. You never really told us, Mason said. Just that Mommy went to heaven when we were born. Richard felt a lump in his throat. That's right, he confirmed softly. She was an amazing person. You have her eyes. It was a guess since he'd never met Amber, but the boy's eyes, a deeper blue than his or Robert's, must have come from somewhere else. The day of the court hearing and the board meeting finally arrived. Richard woke at 5 in the morning. Long before his alarm, his mind already racing with strategies for both challenges ahead. He dressed with extra care. His best Italian suit, a crisp white shirt, a subtle but elegant tie, freshly polished shoes. Full corporate armor. The boys were still asleep when he went downstairs for coffee. Mrs. Wilson, however, was already busy. In the kitchen. You look very elegant today, she remarked, pouring him a cup of strong coffee. Big day? Decisive, corrected Richard, for both the boys and the company. The housekeeper nodded understandingly. In just a week, she had witnessed the changes the Triplets had brought to the mansion and her employer. It'll all work out, she assured him with conviction. You're a different man since they arrived. More human. The observation took Richard by surprise. Was it true? Had he become more human? Or had he simply regained a humanity he had meticulously suppressed over the years in his pursuit of material success? Before leaving, he wrote a note for the boys. Important hearing today. I promise I'll be the first to arrive at your school play at 5 p.m. Love, Dad. He left the note on the kitchen table, feeling strange signing as Dad, as if he were committing fraud. Which, in a way, he was. The hearing was scheduled for 10 a.m. at the county courthouse. Richard met Louis on the steps of the imposing building. Do we have everything we need? He asked, nervously adjusting his tie. Full documentation, confirmed I. The lawyer. Robert's consent statement, proof of income, background check, home inspection, certifying suitable conditions for the children. I hired the best family consulting firm for the report. Richard nodded, grateful to have such a meticulous attorney. When they entered the courtroom, they found the social worker, Margaret, already waiting. The judge, a middle-aged woman with a tired but attentive expression, entered promptly at 10 a.m. After the initial formalities, the case was presented. Temporary custody of minors whose biological father was temporarily unable to care for them. "Mr. Mitchell," the judge began, peering at him over her glasses, "you understand that the custody you're requesting, though temporary, implies full legal and emotional responsibility for these children." "Absolutely, Your Honor," Richard replied firmly. "And do you plan to enroll them in a suitable school, arrange regular medical checkups, and provide a stable environment for their development?" "Yes, ma'am. I've already contacted St. Benedict Academy, which agreed to accept them despite the semester being underway. I have also scheduled full checkups next week with pediatrician Dr. Oliver." The judge seemed impressed by his preparation. She flipped through the documents, carefully reviewing each report. "Ms. Parker, what's your current assessment of the situation?" Margaret stood, adjusting her glasses. "I conducted an initial visit a week ago and found conditions unsuitable for the children. However, an unannounced follow-up yesterday revealed substantial changes. Mr. Mitchell has reorganized his residence, hired qualified staff for supervision, and, most importantly, adjusted his work schedule to be present in the boys' lives." Richard suppressed a sigh of relief. Margaret's surprise visit the day before, when they were all at the pool, had been providential. "I still have reservations about the long-term stability of this arrangement," the social worker continued. "First, but given the alternative of separating the brothers in the foster system, I recommend approving temporary custody with regular supervision." The judge deliberated for a moment before announcing her decision. "I grant temporary custody of minors, Michael, Matthew, and Mason, to Mr. Richard Mitchell for a period of 6 months, after which the situation will be reassessed. You must permit monthly visits from Child Welfare Services and keep the court informed of any significant changes in circumstances." She struck the gavel, adjourning the session. Richard felt a wave of relief, followed immediately by anxiety about the day's next battle, the board meeting. "Congratulations," said Louis, shaking his hand. "You're officially the legal guardian of the triplets." "For now," Richard reminded him, "until Robert comes back." The lawyer hesitated. "Richard, speaking as your friend now, not as your attorney, have you considered the possibility that your brother might not come back? If his illness is as serious as it seems," Richard cut him off, "we'll deal with that when the time comes. Right now, I have another battle to face." When he arrived at the headquarters of Mitchell Properties, Richard could feel the tension in the air. Employees watched him with expressions ranging from sympathy to poorly concealed curiosity. Paul was waiting for him at the entrance of the conference room, as nervous as ever. "They're all inside," he informed. "Victoria brought Timothy from accounting to present numbers that supposedly show administrative negligence in recent days." Richard smirked sarcastically. "The same numbers she refused to update when I asked last week?" Understanding dawned on Paul's face. "Exactly. She's manipulating the data." "Then let's set the record straight," Richard replied, adjusting his jacket before stepping into the conference room. 7 faces turned to watch him. Victoria, elegant in her red pantsuit, occupied the seat to the right of the board chairman, a symbolically powerful position that should have been his. "Richard, so glad you could join us," she greeted with false warmth. "We were just discussing your recent involvement with the company." Richard quickly assessed the room. 2 members were clearly aligned with Victoria. 2 others kept their expressions unreadable, likely still undecided. The remaining 3, including the chairman, watched him with curiosity, but no apparent hostility. Instead of sitting, Richard remained standing, naturally assuming a position of authority. "Gentlemen, madam," he began, nodding slightly at Victoria, "I've been informed there are concerns about my dedication to the company. Let me clarify the situation." For the next half hour, Richard meticulously detailed every ongoing project, every decision made in the last 10 days, every performance metric. He used the projector to display charts and tables Paul had prepared, proving that no indicators had declined. On the contrary, more efficient delegation had actually sped up some processes. "As you can see," he concluded, observing the now impressed expressions of the board, "the company hasn't just maintained its pace, it's improved in efficiency, all while I've implemented better time management to handle important personal responsibilities." Victoria looked increasingly uncomfortable. When she finally got a chance to speak, her main argument had already been undermined. "The numbers are impressive, Richard," she admitted, trying to regain control. "But this isn't just about immediate results, it's about long-term stability. The board needs to know, who are these children who suddenly appeared in your life, and how can we be sure this new family arrangement won't affect your judgment?" It was the question Richard had expected, the attempt to turn his personal life into a corporate issue. For a moment, he considered keeping the story simple, omitting details, but something inside him rebelled against more lies. "They're my nephews," he answered honestly, surprising even himself. "My twin brother's children. He's dealing with serious health issues. I've temporarily taken custody of them, as confirmed by the court this morning." A murmur spread through the room. Few there had even known about the existence of a twin brother. "This responsibility has made me reevaluate my work methods," Richard continued. "I realized I was spending hours on tasks that could easily be delegated. Who micromanaged processes where our internal talents could flourish with more autonomy?" He turned directly to Victoria. "Actually, I should thank you for this opportunity to demonstrate how more efficient leadership, focused on results rather than hours in the office, can benefit Mitchell Properties." The board chairman, Mr. Matthews, a 70-year-old man with decades of business experience, cleared his throat. "Richard, this situation with your brother and the nephews, is it permanent?" "For now, it's temporary," Richard replied cautiously. "But regardless of what happens, I've learned I can be a more effective leader when I maintain a balance between work and personal life." Mr. Matthews exchanged glances with the other board members. There seemed to be a silent communication. Before he spoke again, "I believe we have enough information to vote on the matter of confidence raised by Mrs. Price." The vote was quick and decisive, 5-2 in favor of Richard, with Victoria and her closest ally forming the dissenting minority. The board reaffirms its confidence in Richard Mitchell as executive president of the company, Mr. Matthews announced formally. "And I'll add personally that it's refreshing to see one of our executives recognize the importance of family. My biggest regret was sacrificing time with my children for this company." Richard felt an enormous weight lifted from his shoulders. He had won both battles of the day, but strangely, the courtroom victory for the boys' custody felt far more significant than keeping his position. When the meeting ended, Victoria approached him, her professional composure intact despite the defeat. "Clever move, Richard," she remarked coldly. "Using the children to gain sympathy was unexpected." "It wasn't a move, Victoria," he replied calmly. "Just the truth. Maybe you should try it sometime." He checked his watch, 4:15 p.m. If he left now, he'd make it in time for the little play the Triplets had prepared with Chloe. He'd promised to be the first one there. "Excuse me, I have an important commitment," he said, bidding farewell to the board members. "More important than the 4:30 strategy meeting?" Victoria asked, incredulous. Richard smiled. "Much more. My nephews are performing their first play. Paul can represent me at the strategy meeting." As he drove home, Richard reflected on the transformations of that past week, not just in his house, which now had colors, sounds, and a controlled chaos he never imagined tolerating, but mostly within himself. Something fundamental had changed. His priorities had been rearranged in a way he would have considered unthinkable a week earlier. He arrived home at 4:55 p.m., 5 minutes before the showtime. Mrs. Wilson, Chloe, and even the gardener had been invited to watch. A small audience for the three little actors who, according to Chloe, had spent the entire day rehearsing. The makeshift theater was set up in the living room, with bed sheets hung to form a rustic stage. Richard sat in the front row, feeling a genuine anticipation he hadn't experienced in years. The play was a chaotic and adorable mix of stories Richard had told the boys, scenes from movies they'd watched together, and pure childlike imagination. Michael played an adventurer, of course. Matthew alternated between a scientist and a tough, friendly monster, while Mason narrated the story with his characteristic seriousness. At one point, Mason looked directly at Richard while reciting, and the man realized the treasure he sought wasn't in distant caves, but in his own home all along. Richard felt a lump in his throat. The message, even coming from a 7-year-old, struck him deeply. After the enthusiastic applause from the small audience, the boys ran to Richard, buzzing with energy and pride. "Did you like it, Dad?" asked Michael, still wearing his makeshift explorer's hat. "It was the best play I've ever seen," Richard answered sincerely, hugging all three at once. That night, after the boys finally fell asleep, exhausted from the day's excitement, Richard received a message from Robert. "Admitted to Mercy General Hospital. Not doing well. We need to talk about the future." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. Mercy General Hospital was on the outskirts of New York City, far from the top-tier medical centers Richard usually visited. The emergency room was packed when he arrived at 10:30 p.m., with people waiting on worn-out plastic chairs. He checked in at reception and was directed to the 3rd floor, the oncology wing. The contrast with the private hospitals he was used to was stark. Peeling paint on the walls, visibly outdated equipment, overworked nurses rushing from room to room. Room 307 was semi-private, with 2 beds separated only by a thin curtain. Robert occupied the bed near the window, even paler and weaker than during their last meeting. An IV was connected to his left arm, and a heart monitor beeped steadily. "You came," Robert said, trying to sit up when he saw his brother. "Stay down," Richard instructed, pulling a chair to the bedside. "How are you feeling?" Robert gave a weak smile. "Like someone with late-stage leukemia. Nothing a good bone marrow transplant wouldn't fix, but I'm past the treatment window." Richard frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means I've missed my chances," Robert explained resignedly. "By the time I finally got care, the disease had progressed too far. Now it's just maintenance." "That's absurd," Richard protested, his voice louder than intended. "There must be specialists, experimental treatments." "That cost a fortune," Robert finished. "I know you could afford it, Richard, but that's not why I called you here." "Why then?" Robert took a deep breath, a painful inhale that made the heart monitor spike briefly. "I need you to promise me you'll take care of the boys, not just temporarily, permanently." Richard felt the weight of those words. This wasn't the same as looking after his nephews for a few weeks while Robert recovered. They were talking about a lifelong responsibility. "Robert, I don't know if I'm the right person for this. I'm single, a workaholic. I never planned on having kids, and yet you got custody of them today," Robert interrupted. "The investigator you hired is efficient but not as discreet as you think. I know about the court hearing." Richard didn't deny it. "It was just a precaution to keep them safe until you got back." Robert shook his head sadly. "I'm not coming back, Richard. The doctors gave me weeks, 2 months at most." The silence that followed was heavy, laden with years of unspoken emotions. Finally, Richard asked what he really wanted to know. "Why didn't you ever reach out before, even after Amber passed away?" Robert finished softly. "Because I was too proud. Because I thought you'd say, 'I told you so,' that you'd judge me for every wrong choice I made." Richard remembered their last fight, the cruel words they'd exchanged. Maybe Robert was right. Maybe back then he had judged his brother. "I wouldn't have done that," he said, unsure if it was true. Robert smiled faintly. "Maybe not now. You've changed." "The boys changed you, didn't they?" It was true, Richard nodded. "They're extraordinary. Each in their own way. That's why I know you're the right person," Robert continued. "I saw how you transformed your home for them, how you rearranged your life. I know you already care about them. They think I'm you, Robert, and with each day I keep up this charade, it gets harder to imagine how to tell them the truth." Robert shifted uncomfortably in bed. "I know. It's my fault, but now I think we need to tell them the truth together." "When?" "Tomorrow. Bring them here, it's time." Richard hesitated. "Are you sure it'll be a shock for them?" "The longer we wait, the worse it'll be," Robert replied with surprising strength in his weak voice. "They deserve to understand what's happening, and his voice faltered slightly, "need to see them one last time, knowing they'll be well taken care of." Richard nodded solemnly. "What time?" In the morning. I'm usually strongest in the early hours. Leaving the hospital, Richard sat in his luxury car for long minutes, unable to start the engine. How would he explain it to the boys? How could he prepare them to see their real father in that state, to understand that the father they'd lived with for the past week was actually an uncle they barely knew? When he got home, he found Mrs. Wilson waiting in the living room, knitting under the soft glow of a lamp. "Are the boys all right?" he asked, sinking heavily onto the sofa. "Sleeping like angels," she assured him. "How's your brother?" Richard looked at her in surprise. "How? I've worked for you for 15 years, the housekeeper explained with a gentle smile. "I know every photograph in this house, including the one you keep hidden in your desk drawer. 2 identical boys on a boat." Richard remembered the photo. Him and Robert at 12 years old, in a rare, happy moment with their father before everything fell apart. "He's not well," Richard admitted. "Advanced leukemia. Not much time left." Mrs. Wilson closed her eyes briefly in silent prayer. "Do the boys know?" "They don't know anything. They think I'm their father. Tomorrow we'll tell them the truth." The housekeeper set her knitting aside. "It'll be hard for them. I'm afraid of how they'll react," Richard confessed, surprised by his own vulnerability. "I'm afraid they'll hate me for lying, reject Robert for sending them to me, feel betrayed." "Children are more resilient than we think," Mrs. Wilson replied wisely. "And these boys in particular have already been through so many changes in life. The truth, no matter how painful, is always the best way." That night, Richard slept little. He rose before dawn, mentally preparing what he'd say to his nephews. He decided to be honest but careful, adapting his words for 7-year-olds without hiding the seriousness of the situation. At 7 in the morning, when the triplets came downstairs for breakfast, still in their pajamas with tousled hair, they found Richard already at the table, serious and thoughtful. "Good morning, Dad," Michael greeted cheerfully, always the first to speak. "What are we doing today?" Richard took a deep breath. "Boys, we need to talk about something important. After breakfast, we're going on a special visit." Something in his tone alerted them. Mason, always the most perceptive, studied his uncle's face carefully. "Did something bad happen?" he asked directly. "Not exactly bad," Richard replied, choosing his words carefully. "But it's something serious you need to know." Breakfast passed in unusual silence. Sensing the gravity of the situation, the boys ate without their usual side chatter and playfulness. Even Matthew, normally full of questions, stayed quiet, casting anxious glances at Richard. After breakfast, Richard asked them to get dressed. "We're going to visit someone very special," he explained, offering no details. In the car, the tension was palpable. Richard drove in silence, occasionally glancing in the rearview mirror at the 3 boys sitting in the back seat, each lost in their own thoughts. "Where are we going?" Matthew finally asked, as they entered an unfamiliar part of the city. "To a hospital," Richard answered honestly. "There's someone there who really needs to see you." "Someone in the family?" Matthew pressed. Richard nodded without elaborating. When they parked in front of Mercy General Hospital, the boys stared at the plain building with confused expressions. "This isn't the hospital you take us to when we're sick," Michael remarked, likely referring to some private clinic Robert could occasionally afford. "No, it's not," Richard agreed. "Come on, someone's waiting for you." In the elevator, Richard knelt to be at eye level with his nephews. "Boys, what you're about to see might be hard to understand at first, but I need you to be strong and remember above all that you're very loved." The 3 looked at him with solemn expressions, nodding without fully comprehending. When the elevator stopped on the 3rd floor, Richard held Mason and Matthew's hands while Michael held Matthew's, forming a small human chain down the hospital hallway. Before entering room 307, Richard paused again. "Remember, whatever questions you have afterward, I'll be here to answer them. I promise." When they entered the room, Robert was sitting on the bed, visibly having made an effort to look presentable. He'd combed his hair, shaved, and even put on a clean shirt over his hospital gown. But nothing could hide his extreme pallor, the gauntness of his face, or the dark circles under his sunken eyes. The boys' reaction was immediate and unsettling. They looked from Robert to Richard and back again, their small faces registering confusion, then shock, then gradual understanding. "Dad?" Michael murmured uncertainly, staring at Robert. "But—" Matthew turned to Richard, then back to the man in bed. "He's also Dad?" Mason, as always, was the most perceptive. "You're twins," he concluded quietly. "Like us." Robert weakly stretched out his arms to his sons. "Come here, my boys," he called, his voice choked. "I have a lot to explain to you." The triplets approached hesitantly, still processing the presence of two identical men, still trying to grasp what it meant. Richard stepped back into a corner of the room, allowing Robert this moment with his children. He watched as his brother hugged each boy, kissed their foreheads, and held their small hands in his own, now so fragile. "This is Uncle Richard, my twin brother," Robert finally explained, gesturing toward Richard. "You've been staying with him this past week." "But why?" Michael asked, always direct. "Why did you leave us with him? Why did he pretend to be you?" The question hung in the air, heavy with accusation and confusion. Robert glanced at Richard, silently asking for help. Richard stepped forward, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Your father is sick, boys," he said gently. "Very sick. He needed to come to the hospital and wanted to make sure you were well taken care of." "And you look so much alike," Robert continued, his voice weak but firm. "I thought it would be easier for you if you believed you were still with your dad. It was wrong, I know. I should have trusted you'd understand." The boys processed the information slowly, looking from one man to the other. "So as you're our uncle?" Matthew asked Richard, his voice small and uncertain. "Yes," Richard confirmed. "I'm your father's brother, your uncle." Mason, who had remained silent, observing everything with his sharp eyes, finally spoke. "Are you going to get better, Dad?" The question, so simple and direct, hit Robert like a physical blow. He closed his eyes briefly, gathering courage. "I'm very sick, Mason," he answered honestly. "The doctors are doing everything they can, but I might have to go meet Mom." The boys' eyes widened at the implication. Even at 7 years old, they understood what meet Mom meant. "No," protested Michael, tears welling in his eyes. "You can't. We just found you again." Robert hugged his son, his own face wet with tears. "I know, champ, I don't want to go either, but if it happens, Uncle Richard will take very good care of you. He promised." The triplets turned to Richard, their gazes a mix of fear, confusion, and a silent question. Was it true? "I promised," Richard confirmed, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat, "and I always keep my promises." The hours that followed were an emotional roller coaster. Robert explained his illness to his children in simple but honest terms. He told them his disappearance the past few days had been to arrange things for them, to make sure they'd be safe. He apologized for the lie, explaining he'd acted out of love, even if it was misguided. The boys in turn went from confusion to anger, anger to sadness, and finally to a reluctant but brave acceptance that made Richard admire them even more. "You can visit your dad whenever you want," Richard assured them. "I'll be here with you every time." When it was time to leave, the triplets didn't want to let go of their father. Michael clung to Robert's arm. Matthew buried his face in his father's chest, and Mason held his hand tightly, as if sheer determination could keep him alive. "Come back tomorrow," Robert promised, kissing each on the forehead. "I'll be waiting." In the hallway, the boys walked in silence, processing everything they'd just learned. Richard didn't force conversation, giving them space to take it all in. It wasn't until they were in the car that Mason asked the question clearly on his mind from the start. "Uncle Richard, do you really want us? Or are you just doing this because you promised Dad?" The question struck Richard deeply. It was a legitimate worry for a child who'd clearly already faced so much instability in life. "Mason, listen," he replied, turning to look all three in the eyes. "I really do want you. The truth is, I never knew how much I needed you in my life until you came. You're not a burden or an obligation. You're a gift I never knew I wanted, but now I couldn't live without." Mason's eyes studied his face, searching for signs of dishonesty but finding only sincerity. Slowly the boy nodded, accepting the answer. "So you're our Uncle Dad now?" asked Matthew, always trying to sort things into understandable categories. Richard smiled. "If that's what you want to call me, I'm fine with it. I'm just gonna call you Uncle, decided Michael, always the most direct, because we only have one dad. Of course, Richard agreed, admiring his nephew's loyalty. I'm honored to be your uncle. The drive home was lighter, though still heavy with emotion. Richard realized that despite the shock and sadness, there was also some relief in the boys. The truth, however painful, was less frightening than the uncertainty and confusion of the lie. At home, Mrs. Wilson waited with lunch ready and an intuitive sense of what they'd just been through. She asked no questions, just wrapped each boy in a warm hug and offered hot chocolate despite the day's heat. That afternoon, Richard cancelled all his appointments and devoted himself entirely to his nephews. They played board games, watched movies they picked themselves, and eventually, when they were ready, he answered all the questions that came up about the situation. "What's going to happen when Daddy goes to see Mommy?" Mason asked during dinner, voicing the worry that was clearly on all three of their minds. "You'll keep living here with me," Richard explained patiently. "This will be your home. You'll go to school, make friends, have your own lives, and we'll always talk about your father so you never forget him. What if you get tired of us?" Michael asked, surprising Richard with his uncharacteristic vulnerability. "What if it's too much work? Daddy always said we were a lot of work." Richard swallowed hard, thinking of Robert trying to raise 3 boys alone, juggling multiple jobs with no support. Of course it had been a lot of work. "I have something your father didn't," he finally answered. "I have resources, I have help. I have Mrs. Wilson, we have Chloe. I can take time off work when needed. I will never ever get tired of you." The following weeks settled into a new routine. Every day, before or after school, the boys had been accepted at St. Benedict Academy. After assessments showed they needed extra help in some subjects, Richard took the triplets to visit Robert at the hospital. Sometimes the visits were cheerful, filled with games and stories. Other times they were quiet, with Robert too weak for more than a few minutes of interaction. But they were always important, for everyone involved. Meanwhile, life at the Westchester mansion found its new rhythm. The boys' room, now permanently theirs, was decorated to reflect each of their personalities. A reading nook for Mason, a space for building and experiments for Matthew, and a mini-stage for Michael's dramatic performances. 3 single beds that most nights remained empty, as the triplets still preferred sleeping together in the larger bed. At the office, Richard had implemented new policies that caused initial surprise, then admiration. He left promptly at 5, every evening unless there was a real emergency. He worked from home on Fridays, delegated more, micromanaged less. Surprisingly, productivity rose, and the work environment improved. Even Victoria Price, his longtime rival, seemed impressed by the changes. "I have to admit, Richard, you've surprised me," she remarked during a meeting. "I thought your family commitments would hurt the company, but it seems the opposite happened." "Sometimes you have to lose something to realize what truly matters," he replied. "And sometimes you gain something you never knew you needed." At home, Richard discovered sides of himself he never knew existed. He found he had the patience to help with homework, even after an exhausting workday. That he enjoyed watching cartoons with the boys on Saturday mornings. That he could learn to make pancakes, disastrous at first but improving with practice, for Sunday breakfast. The social worker, Margaret, made regular visits, growing more impressed with the family's adjustment each time. "You have a natural talent for this," she commented during her 3rd visit, watching as Richard effortlessly mediated an argument between Michael and Matthew over whose turn it was on the video game. "Some people take years to develop the skills you've shown in weeks," Richard smiled. "It's not me, they're the ones teaching me." As the weeks passed, Robert's health visibly declined. The hospital visits grew shorter, quieter. The doctors began using words like palliative care and comfort, terms Richard understood all too well but tried to filter for the boys. On a particularly difficult afternoon, after a visit where Robert could barely stay awake, Michael exploded in the car on the way home. "I don't want to go to the hospital anymore," he shouted, tears streaming down his face. "I don't want to see Dad like that." Richard pulled the car over to a safe spot and turned to face his nephews. All 3 were crying, each in their own way. Michael loud and angry. Matthew with intermittent sobs. Mason silently, tears just rolling down his cheeks. "I know it's hard," Richard said softly. "It's hard for me too, but your dad needs you now more than ever." "He doesn't even know we're there," Michael protested. "Yes, he does," Richard corrected gently. "Even when he seems asleep, he knows. He feels your presence. That's what keeps him fighting." That night, after the boys had finally fallen asleep, Richard got a call from Paul, his assistant at the company. "Sir, I'm sorry to bother you so late, but an opportunity came up that we can't ignore. The Chinese investors changed their minds. They want to close the deal, but they're demanding a meeting in Shanghai next week. 3 days minimum. 3 days away. Away from the boys, away from Robert, whose condition worsened every day. 6 months ago, Richard wouldn't have thought twice. Now the decision felt impossible. "Paul, I have responsibilities here I can't walk away from," he replied slowly. "My brother is very sick, and the boys depend on me." "I understand, sir. But this deal could mean the expansion we've planned for years. Victoria has already offered to go in your place if you can't." Of course she did, Richard thought. Victoria would never miss a chance to prove she was more committed than him. "I'll think about it and let you know tomorrow," he promised. Hanging up. He spent the night awake, weighing his options. In the morning over breakfast, he laid out the situation to the boys, deciding to treat them as active participants in the decision, not as children to be shielded from reality. "I have to take a business trip," he explained. 3 days, maybe 4. It's very important for the company, but you have to go," Mason surprisingly interrupted, like Dad used to. Richard looked at his most observant nephew, realizing what he was really saying. It was a test. Would Richard abandon them for work like Robert had so often been forced to do? "No, Mason," he corrected gently. "I don't have to go. I want to hear what you think. You're my family now, and families make big decisions together." The three exchanged surprised glances. Clearly, they weren't used to being consulted on adult matters. "What about Dad?" Matthew asked worriedly. "Who'll take us to see him?" "Mrs. Wilson and Chloe can take you," Richard suggested. "But if you'd rather I stay, we'll find another solution for the meeting. Maybe a video call, or sending someone else in my place." "You won't be mad if we say stay?" Michael asked, suddenly looking very small. Richard's heart ached. How many times had these boys swallowed their own wants and needs to avoid burdening an overwhelmed father? "Never," he promised, holding all 3 of their hands across the table. "I'll never be mad at you for needing me. That's why I'm here." After a surprisingly mature discussion, they reached a compromise. Richard would go to China, but only for 2 days, not 3. He'd call every night on video, and he swore, pinky promise, that if there was any change in Robert's condition, he'd come back immediately, important meeting or not. When he relayed his decision to Paul, he was firm. 2 days, no more. "And I need flawless internet at the hotel for daily video calls." Paul, who was gradually adjusting to his boss's new leadership style, didn't question it. "I'll take care of all the arrangements, sir." The day before the trip, Richard took the boys for a special visit to Robert. His brother was having a relatively good day, sitting up in bed instead of lying down, with enough color in his face to look almost healthy, if not for the extreme thinness. "I'm traveling tomorrow," Richard explained to his brother when the boys stepped out for a few minutes, with a nurse who had grown fond of them. "Business in China, I'll be back in 2 days." Robert nodded weakly. "The Chinese investors, I heard you mention them to the boys once." "Yes, it's an important deal." "You don't need to explain, Richard," Robert said with a faint smile. "I know you wouldn't go if it weren't really necessary." Richard studied his brother's face, so similar to his own, and yet so different now. "How are you really feeling?" Robert shrugged, a gesture that clearly took effort. "Like someone with numbered days, but at peace. The boys are fine. With you, they'll be even better." "Robert, Richard began, not quite knowing what to say. There was so much between them, so many lost years, so much unresolved hurt. "I know," Robert interrupted softly. "Me too, we're terrible with words, both of us." When the boys returned, Robert seemed to have gathered new strength. He told stories from his and Richard's childhood, making the boys laugh at the antics of the older twins. He listened intently as each shared their progress at school, their new friends, their life in the Westchester mansion. When it was time to say goodbye, he hugged each of his sons tightly. "Be good to Uncle Richard," he asked. "He loves you, just as much as I do." Richard felt a tightness in his chest. There was a finality in those words that didn't go unnoticed. The next morning, the departure was emotional but surprisingly orderly. The boys, who had helped pack Richard's suitcase the night before, surprised him with a drawing they'd made together. 5 stick figures, them, Richard and Robert, all holding hands under a rainbow. "So you don't forget us," explained Michael. "As if I could," Richard replied, carefully tucking the drawing into his work folder. Shanghai greeted Richard with its usual frenetic energy. Staying in a luxurious hotel overlooking the Huangpu River, he barely noticed the impressive skyscrapers or the city's bright lights. His mind remained in New York City, split between a Westchester mansion and a hospital room on the outskirts. The negotiations were intense but productive. The Chinese investors, initially skeptical about Richard's commitment to the project, were impressed by his meticulous preparation and clear vision. Paul, who accompanied him, watched with admiration as his boss, once known for dragging meetings, late into the night, politely but firmly wrapped up by 5 p.m. New York time to make a video call. Seeing the triplets' faces on the computer screen was like a balm to Richard. They all talked at once, eager to share about their day at school, their visit to their father at the hospital, the new drawing they were making for when he returned. "We miss you," Mason said simply when the other two paused to breathe. "I miss you too," Richard replied sincerely. "But I'll be back soon. How's your father today?" The smiles faded. "Sleeping," Michael answered. "He slept the whole time we were there." Richard felt a pang of worry. "Did Mrs. Wilson talk to the doctors?" "Yes," Matthew replied, "but they only spoke quietly and she wouldn't tell us afterward." After the boys hung up, Richard immediately called Mrs. Wilson. "How is he really?" he asked without preamble. The housekeeper hesitated. "It's getting worse quickly, sir. The doctors don't think he has much time." Richard looked at the settlement papers scattered on the table, then at Paul waiting patiently in the corner of the suite. "Book the first flight back to New York City," he instructed. "We'll wrap up negotiations early tomorrow and leave immediately." The next day, Richard conducted the final meeting with ruthless efficiency. Terms were settled, preliminary documents signed. The Chinese, impressed by his directness, agreed to finalize the remaining details via video conference. "You could have stayed another day for the official ceremony," Paul remarked on the way to the airport. "They consider it important." "There are more important things waiting for me at home," Richard replied simply. The flight to New York City felt endless. Richard alternated between reviewing work documents to distract himself and anxiously checking his watch, calculating how much time remained. When they finally landed, night had fallen in New York City. Instead of going home, he drove straight to the hospital. In Robert's room, he found a nurse adjusting the IV. "Visitors left hours ago," she informed him. "Visiting hours end at 8. "I'm his brother," Richard explained. "I just got back from a trip. Please." Something in his expression must have convinced her, because she nodded discreetly and left them alone. Robert looked like he had aged 10 years in the 2 days Richard had been gone. His breathing was shallow and uneven, his face almost translucent with pallor. He was asleep, or maybe unconscious. Richard wasn't sure of the difference at this point. He sat in the chair beside the bed and took his brother's hand. It was cold, the fingers so thin they felt like bone. "I'm here, Robert," he said, softly. "I'm back." There was no response, just the steady beep of the heart monitor and the faint sound of Robert's labored breathing. "The boys are fine," Richard continued, feeling the need to speak even if his brother couldn't hear. "They're adjusting. They're amazing, you know. So strong, so resilient. You did a great job with them." Richard kept talking in the dim light of the room. He talked about the boys, about the house, about how his life had changed. He spoke of regrets, of lost years, of wishing for more time now. At some point, he dozed off in the uncomfortable chair, still holding his brother's hand. He was awakened in the early hours by a different nurse making rounds. "You shouldn't be here," she said, though she didn't insist he leave. Instead, she brought him a blanket and a cup of coffee. Richard thanked her and checked his watch. 4 in the morning. He should go home, shower, change, be there when the boys woke up. But something kept him there, an intuition he couldn't explain. "I'll stay a little longer," he told the nurse. It was around 5 in the morning, as the first rays of sunlight began filtering through the hospital window, that Robert opened his eyes. For a moment, he seemed disoriented. Then his gaze settled on Richard's face, and a faint smile touched his cracked lips. "You came back," he whispered, so softly Richard had to lean in to hear. "I promised I would," Richard replied, gently squeezing his brother's hand. Robert studied him for a long moment. "You're different," he said finally. "Lighter. They've changed you." Richard nodded. "For the better. Thanks to you." Robert closed his eyes briefly, as if gathering strength. "Take care of them," he murmured. "Tell them stories about me, about their mother." "I will," Richard promised, his throat tight. "Every day." "And take care of yourself too," Robert continued, each word clearly an effort. "You deserve to be happy, Richard." "We both deserved it," replied Richard, tears streaming freely down his face. "I'm so sorry, Robert, for everything." A faint smile appeared on his brother's pale face. "Me too, but now everything is all right." They fell silent for a few minutes, the only sound in the room coming from the medical equipment. Then, with visible effort, Robert spoke again. "Bring them here today. I want to see my boys. One last time." Richard nodded, unable to speak through his tears. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. When he arrived home, the mansion was quiet. It was still early, the boys likely still asleep. Richard took the opportunity to shower quickly and change, trying not to look as exhausted and emotionally drained as he felt. Mrs. Wilson found him in the kitchen, making coffee. "You look tired," she remarked, taking over the coffee maker. "How was the trip?" "Productive," he replied mechanically. "Mrs. Wilson, I need to take the boys to the hospital today. Robert isn't doing well." The housekeeper nodded gravely. "I'll get them ready as soon as they wake up. What time do you want to leave?" "As soon as possible," Richard answered, "and it might be best to prepare them that their father is very weak today." While waiting for his nephews to come downstairs, Richard called Paul, instructing him to cancel all his appointments for the next few days. Then he called his lawyer, Louis. "I need to discuss formally adopting my nephews," he explained, "as soon as possible." "Adoption?" Louis echoed, surprised. "I thought temporary custody." "The situation has changed," Richard interrupted. "I want to make sure they stay with me permanently, with no chance of future disputes." "I understand," the lawyer replied, sensing the urgency in his client's voice. "I'll prepare the necessary paperwork, but it's a process that takes time, Richard, even with your resources." "Do whatever it takes," Richard insisted. "Cost isn't an issue." When the triplets came down for breakfast, still sleepy but excited about their uncle's return, Richard felt a wave of tenderness and protectiveness he'd never experienced before. These boys were now his world, his responsibility, his family. "Uncle Richard!" Michael exclaimed, running to hug him. The other two followed, resulting in a group hug that nearly knocked Richard over. "Did you bring presents?" Matthew asked hopefully, ever practical. Richard laughed despite the situation. "Actually, yes, they're in the car. But first, we need to talk about something important." The boys' smiles vanished instantly, replaced by anxious expressions. They were quick to pick up on shifts in adults' moods, a result of years spent in instability. "Is it about Dad?" Mason asked bluntly. Richard nodded, sitting down to be at their level. "Yes, he's very weak today. We need to go see him as soon as we finish breakfast." "Is he going to—" Michael couldn't finish, his blue eyes filling with tears. "He wants to see you," Richard replied, neither confirming nor denying what they all already knew. "It's very important to him." Breakfast was quiet and quick. The presents, small stuffed pandas from Shanghai, were received with sad but genuine smiles. Then, the four of them headed to the hospital, each lost in their own thoughts. Robert was awake when they arrived, having mustered his last strength for this moment. A doctor pulled Richard aside as the boys approached the bed. "He's holding on by sheer willpower," the doctor explained quietly. It's important the visit isn't too long, 10-15 minutes at most. Richard nodded, grateful for the honesty. He then approached the bed, where the triplets were already, talking with their father, sharing about Richard's return, showing off their stuffed pandas, doing their best to seem cheerful despite the circumstances. Richard watched the interaction with a heavy heart. Robert, even on the brink of the end, found the strength to smile at his sons, to ask about school, to listen to Michael's story about the goal he'd scored during recess. "You're the best thing I've ever done in my life," Robert finally said, his voice weak but clear. "Never ever forget that." The boys nodded solemnly, instinctively sensing the weight of the moment. "And Uncle Richard will take good care of you," Robert continued, looking at his brother. "He's a good man, better than I ever was." "Don't say that," Richard protested, stepping closer to the bed. "You did the best you could with what you had." Robert smiled faintly. "Always the diplomat, aren't you, brother?" He turned back to his sons. "Come here. I want to hug you." One by one, the boys approached, receiving weak but meaningful embraces. Mason, the last one, lingered longer in his father's arms, as if trying to memorize the feeling. "I love you, Daddy," the boy whispered, so softly only Robert could hear. "And I love all three of you," Robert replied, tears streaming down his gaunt face. "More than anything in this world." When the boys stepped back, Robert motioned for Richard to come closer. "Thank you," he whispered, just for his brother to hear. "For everything." Richard held his twin's hand, feeling the fragility of the bones beneath the skin. "I'm the one who should thank you," he answered, his voice thick, "for trusting me with your children. It's the greatest honor of my life." Robert seemed satisfied with the answer. He closed his eyes briefly, then looked at his sons one last time. "Be good, be happy, and remember, I'll always be watching over you." The boys nodded, tears now flowing freely. Richard, sensing Robert, had reached his limit, gently guided his nephews out of the room, promising they could return the next day. In the hallway, he hugged all three as they openly wept. "You were amazing in there," he praised, his own voice shaky. "Your father is so proud of you. I am too." He led them to the car, but before getting in, his phone rang. It was Robert's doctor. Stepping a few paces away so the boys wouldn't hear, Richard answered. The conversation was brief. When he returned to the car, his face was pale but composed. "Let's go home," he said softly. "It's been a hard day for all of us." That night, for the first time since they'd arrived at the mansion, Richard let the three sleep in his king-size bed. Nestled against him, one on each side and Matthew at the foot, the boys finally fell asleep, exhausted from the emotional turmoil of the day. Richard, however, stayed awake, watching their identical faces relax in sleep. So young to face such loss. First the mother they'd never known, now their father. And yet, there was a resilience in them that constantly amazed him. The next morning, a clear and sunny Sunday, Richard gathered the triplets in the living room. He sat across from them, searching for the right words. "Boys, I have something very difficult to tell you," he began gently. "Your father, he passed away during the night. He's gone to be with your mother now." The three looked at him in silence, processing the news. It wasn't unexpected, but the finality of it was still devastating. "Did he suffer?" Mason asked, always the most concerned about others' feelings. "No," Richard assured. "It was very peaceful, like falling asleep." Michael was the first to cry, great sobs shaking his small body. Matthew joined him, quieter, but just as heartbroken. Mason, surprisingly, remained dry-eyed, as if he had moved beyond tears to something deeper. Richard embraced all three boys, allowing each to grieve in their own way. He offered no empty words of comfort, didn't say everything would be all right. Instead, he cried with them, sharing their pain, validating it. "What happens now?" Matthew finally asked when the sobs had subsided. "Tomorrow we'll say goodbye to your father in a special ceremony," Richard explained. "After that, we stick together as a family. I'll take care of you, just as I promised your father. Just as I promised you. Forever, Michael pressed, his eyes swollen from crying. Forever, Richard confirmed. The following days were a blur of arrangements and emotions. Richard organized a simple yet dignified ceremony for Robert, ensuring it was appropriate for children to attend. The triplets, dressed in matching suits, stood by their uncle the entire time, occasionally squeezing his hand when emotions overwhelmed them. Surprisingly, several of Richard's co-workers attended, including Paul and, most unexpectedly, Victoria Price. Even Mr. Matthews, the board president, made an appearance to offer condolences. "You never mentioned having a twin brother," Victoria remarked quietly during the reception after the ceremony, "let alone triplet nephews." "There were family complications," Richard replied vaguely. "We're sorting it out now." "They're adorable," she observed, watching the three boys politely chatting with Mr. Matthews. "They've changed you." Richard considered her words. "For the better, I hope." "Definitely for the better," Victoria confirmed with a surprisingly genuine smile. "You used to be a robot, Richard. Efficient, brilliant, but cold. Now there's something human in you. It's refreshing." In the weeks that followed, life settled into a new normal. The boys returned to school, now officially enrolled and wearing uniforms that actually fit, not oversized hand-me-downs. Richard adjusted his work schedule to be home when they returned, helping with homework, listening to stories about their day. On Sundays, they established a ritual of visiting the cemetery in the morning, bringing flowers for Robert and for Amber in a symbolic grave, since her body lay in another city. Afterward, they spent the rest of the day doing whatever the boys chose: the park, movies, a trip to the mall, or just games at home. The adoption process moved forward with the efficiency Richard's money and connections could ensure. The social worker, Margaret, became an unexpected ally, impressed by the transformation in both the boys' lives and Richard's. "It's rare to see an improvised family come together so well," she remarked during one of her now monthly visits. "You all seem made for each other." Maybe they were, Richard thought. Maybe the boys were exactly what he needed to remember what it meant to be human. And maybe he was exactly what they needed, someone with the means to give them stability, who had also learned through them how to give love. On the eve of the triplets' 8th birthday, 6 months after they had entered his life, Richard took them to a special dinner at their favorite restaurant, a noisy pizzeria he would never have set foot in before. At the end of the meal, he handed each boy an envelope. "What's this?" Michael asked, always the first to speak. "Open it and see," Richard suggested, trying to hide his nervousness. Inside each envelope was a legal document, too complex for 8-year-olds to fully grasp. But the bolded phrase at the top was clear: "Petition for adoption." "Does this mean—" began Matthew, looking from the paper to Richard. "It means that if you agree, I want to officially adopt you," Richard explained. "Legally, you'll be my children, not just my nephews under my care, but my sons, forever." The boys exchanged glances, having one of those silent conversations only triplets seemed capable of. "But what about Dad?" Mason asked hesitantly. "We won't forget him, will we?" "Never," Richard said firmly. "He'll always be your father. I'll also be your dad. You'll have 2 fathers, one who loved you so much he found the best possible home for you before he left, and another who promises to love and care for you for the rest of your life." Michael, impulsive as always, was the first to answer. "I want to. Can I call you Dad now?" Richard's heart raced. "If you want, or you can keep calling me Uncle, whatever feels right for you." "I want to too," Matthew decided, always following his bolder brother. They all looked at Mason, the most thoughtful of the 3. He studied Richard's face for a long moment before nodding. "Yes, I think Dad would be happy." Richard smiled, feeling an emotion he couldn't name. It wasn't just happiness, though there was plenty of that. It was something deeper, more permanent. Belonging, perhaps. Purpose. "Then it's decided," he declared, raising his soda glass for a toast. "To our family. Not the one we expected, but exactly the one we needed." The boys laughed, lifting their own glasses in a clumsy toast that spilled soda on the table. 6 months ago, Richard would have been annoyed by the mess. Now, he just smiled and asked for more napkins. The next morning, the triplets' official birthday, Richard woke up early to prepare a surprise. When the boys came down for breakfast, they found the dining room decorated with balloons and a banner that read, "Happy birthday, Michael, Matthew, and Mason." On the table, besides individual gifts for each, was a huge cake with 8 candles. "Have you ever had cake for breakfast before?" Richard asked, smiling at their shocked expressions. "Never," Michael answered, already running to the table. "Dad said sweets in the morning would make us hyper at school." "Well, today's an exception," Richard decided. "Birthdays are for breaking rules, just a little." As he watched his 3 nephew sons happily devouring the chocolate cake before 8 a.m., Richard couldn't help but think of Robert. His brother had given him the greatest gift possible. He'd entrusted him with his sons. Richard would do everything in his power to honor that trust. After the sugary breakfast came the presents. Each boy received gifts tailored to his interests. For Michael, sports equipment to match his energetic nature. For Matthew, science and building kits to fuel his curiosity. For Mason, books and a journal for his thoughtful personality. But the most impactful gift came last. Richard handed them a large envelope addressed to the Mitchell brothers. Inside were documents from the most prestigious school in New York City, confirming their enrollment for the next school year. Along with the papers were brochures for a special academic support program to help the boys catch up after their disrupted education. "It's the best school in the city," Richard explained. "With the best teachers, labs, sports fields, everything. But only if you want to go. If you'd rather stay where you are, that's fine too." The boys examined the colorful brochures with thoughtful expressions. "Is it really expensive?" Mason asked, always practical. "Don't worry about that," Richard assured them. "I can easily afford it. In fact," he hesitated, then decided to reveal the rest of the plan. "I've set up an education fund for the 3 of you. For college, graduate school, whatever you want to study in the future." "College," repeated Matthew, his eyes wide. "Dad always said it was impossible." "Nothing is impossible now," Richard assured him. "You can be anything you want. Doctors, lawyers, businessmen, astronauts, artists, whatever your heart's desire." Michael, always the most emotional, threw himself into his uncle's arms. "Thank you, Uncle Dad," he murmured against his chest. The other 2 joined the hug, creating a tangle of arms and bodies that made Richard laugh and cry at the same time. That night, after the birthday party with their new school friends ended, after the gifts were put away and the boys were nearly asleep, Richard sat on the edge of Mason's bed. The 3 had finally agreed to sleep in their own beds, though often one or all of them ended up in Richard's bed after nightmares or storms. "Happy birthday, champ," he said softly, adjusting the blanket around his most observant nephew. "Was it a good day?" "The best," Mason replied sleepily. "Uncle Richard?" "Yes?" "I think Dad sent us to you on purpose." Richard smiled. "How so?" "He knew you needed us as much as we needed you," Mason explained with the surprising wisdom he sometimes showed. "We were all a little lost, weren't we?" Richard felt a lump in his throat. "We were, but now we've found each other." Mason agreed, his eyes already closing. "And we'll stay together forever, right?" "Forever," Richard promised, kissing his nephew's forehead. "Sleep well, son." As he left the room, stopping to check on Michael, already sprawled across his bed, and Matthew, murmuring in his sleep, Richard felt filled with a quiet certainty. Life had given him a direction he could never have predicted, presenting challenges he never imagined facing. But here in that house that was once just a cold mansion and was now a home full of life, noise, and yes, some mess, Richard Mitchell finally understood what truly mattered. It wasn't the million-dollar deals, the corporate acquisitions, or even the professional success he had chased so obsessively. It was this: 3 little hearts that trusted him completely, teaching him daily about unconditional love, bringing purpose and meaning to his existence. Returning to his office, Richard took out the photograph from his desk drawer that Mrs. Wilson had mentioned. Him and Robert at 12 years old, smiling on their father's small boat. He placed it on the desk beside the new framed photo. Him and the triplets at the park, all smiling under the golden sunset. "Thank you, brother," he whispered to Robert's image, "for trusting me, for giving me a second chance, for bringing me back to life through your children." Outside, the night in New York City pulsed with its usual energy. Inside the Westchester mansion, now a true home, a new family found its rhythm and harmony. Not the family any of them had planned or expected, but exactly the family they all needed. The end. Dear listener, did this story touch your heart? Share your thoughts in the comments and tell us which moment moved you the most. If you enjoyed this journey of family transformation, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more heartwarming stories.